Well, I think the reluctance to open this track and keep it going has been that it opens the door for discussions about compensation. In a sense, loss and damage is a euphemism for that, accepted euphemism. The question is, but then there's still a lot of technical work that needs to be done. Exactly what is the loss and damage? How do we measure it? How do we attribute it? So there's a long way to go before questions of genuine compensation might arise. But it does open the door, and that's why they want to close the door.
And is the door being closed or is it being slammed? Is there absolute, are developing countries, absolutely adamant this is not going to happen?
I think the opposite is the case. They have been absolutely adamant for a long time, because this is not a new issue in terms of it being raised. It's new in terms of it being accepted to be discussed. The AOSIS countries have been raising this now for the last 10 years, but only recently has it been taken on board as something worth discussing. So I think the opposite is the case. Developing countries are not going to allow it to be slammed, whatever the developed countries want. So if they want anything out of Doha, they're going to have to give on this.
And how much does this particular strand of talks feed in and take out of other debates, such as equity discussions and common but differentiated responsibility? Are they effectively one in the same?
They are very intimately related, although this is somewhat of a new track, and therefore it's still something that is in evolution. It's not fully agreed, which is one of the reasons why the developing countries want to continue it. So with the continued work program, for example, there will be opportunities to discuss the various aspects of it, including an equity aspect of it, and to at least come to some agreement on some parts of it, if not all parts of it. And therefore, this should continue and not be closed down in Doha.
And in terms of the arguments for and against, the arguments for seem fairly clear, but in terms of the arguments against, can you give us an idea of what those kind of sticking points are?
Well, the argument against being made by some of the Annex 1 countries is that there's nothing new under loss and damage. It's all old stuff, adaptation, we can deal with it in adaptation, science, we can deal with in substuff. So let's just put it in the different parts that we already have, and therefore we don't need a separate track on loss and damage. I don't think they're going to get away with that. There is a very strong logic that this is something new. It's about the limits of adaptation. It's about the limits of mitigation. What are we going to do when we reach those limits? And we will reach those limits, and we have to talk about it.
I mean, in a sense, it seems quite an interesting development, although you said it's been around for 10 years, and I think I'm right in saying it's really started in Cancun, but we're effectively talking about a strand of negotiations which acknowledges that dangerous climate change is going to happen and that we need to have a plan. So in a sense, that's quite that's a sort of seismic shift, isn't it, for a sort of an organisation which is aimed at stopping climate change?
I think so. My own view of this is that Doha really marks the beginning of what I would term the third era of climate change. The first era being the first decade of mitigation being the solution, and we put all our efforts in that with Kyoto, then realizing that mitigation wasn't going to be enough and we needed to do adaptation, so we've had a whole decade of doing adaptation. Now we realize either of those aren't really working. We're going to have to deal with some residual damage, and loss and damage is that new issue. And the Framework Convention is not geared to dealing with the problem after it occurs. The Framework Convention is to prevent the problem, but we failed to prevent the problem, so the Convention is going to have to deal with what do we do with that failure.
The UK Climate Minister Greg Barker was asked a question about this in a press conference about an hour ago, and he made what I thought was quite an interesting observation. He said that there's more responsibility on nations who have emitted substantial amounts of carbon dioxide after the science was clear than there was before, which is an interesting argument. And what do you make of that? How could that potentially feed into the kind of loss and damage debate? Because I suppose in other forms of law or justice, that argument might actually wash.
Well, there is some logic to it, but at this point in time, the loss and damage issue is about how to deal with real losses and damages. It's not about attributing, it's not about compensating, it's about realizing and accepting the fact that there are going to be very, very real losses and damages around the world. And this isn't just a developing country issue. The rich countries are going to have them. New York just had about $100 billion worth of loss and damage. Okay, so it's an issue for all countries. We need a logical and an acceptable way of dealing with this and coming up with solutions for it. And the question of blaming and compensation, to me, is secondary. It is part of it, but we don't have to tackle that right now.
Okay, and I guess just a final point, in terms of how important this is to two different blocks involved in this process, is this a kind of deal breaker in terms of whether or not some people will, continue with this process, or at least continue with this conference?
I think it has become a deal breaker on behalf of a significant proportion of the developing countries, namely the AOSIS, who've led on this, now strongly supported by the Least Developed Countries Group and the Africa Group. That's over 100 countries, and that's the majority in the UNFCCC. And if they stick to their guns, then it's a deal breaker if they don't get